Right, so hi everyone, happy to have you here. Just before we start, just a couple of heads up. First of all, the Conversatorio will be recorded and will be posted on our website. So if for some reason you don't want to have your faces on screen, just please turn off the camera. And as you know, we expect this Conversatorio to last for about an hour, but we might have some time for questions at the end. So we'll see if we can have some other interventions by our audience. So my name is Gianfranco Selgas, and welcome to this Conversatorio on liquid ecologies organized by Rizoma. Rizoma is an environmental humanities platform for dialogue, discussion, and exchange of ideas on issues concerning the relationships between art, ecology, and science in the Latin American and Caribbean context. We think of Rizoma as a space to speculate and experiment collectively in the elaboration and epistemic search for assemblages between culture and the environment. The emphasis on Latin America responds to a question of belonging, situated interest, and academic background that links us geoculturally to the region from the Nordic countries where we're based. My colleague Azucena Castro and myself, editors of this lab, seek to provide a space in the environmental humanities for thinking with plants, animals, textures, and earth rhythms that question the divisions between humans and non-humans through post-anthropocentric thoughts and experiments. So today we are very pleased, happy, and grateful to welcome Lisa Blackmore and Liliana Gómez to this Conversatorio on liquid ecologies, bodies of water, and hydro-humanities. Azucena.
Hello, my name is Azucena Castro, and I will introduce our guests and co-authors of the book Liquid Ecologies in Latin American and Caribbean Art, a book that we have read and discussed in courses and that we have taken and taught both at Stockholm University and the University of Buenos Aires. Liliana Gómez is a professor at the University of Kassel. She writes on media history and theory of literature and art in modern and contemporary times, and on the interplay between the arts and social transformation processes in a global context. She works on the interrelationship between literature, visual art, archives, and their institutional entanglements, these discourses and narratives of law and human rights, as well as social ecologies, especially in Latin America. Since 2017, she has directed the SNSF research project titled Contested Amnesia and Dissonant Narratives of the Global South, Post-Conflict in Literature, Art, and Emergent Archives. Lisa Blackmore is Senior Lecturer in Art History and Interdisciplinary Studies at the University of Essex. She is a specialist in Latin American cultural studies, working at the intersections of practice and research, combining writing on the arts, ecology, and memory with curatorial and audiovisual projects. Lisa researches the aesthetics and politics of modernity in Latin American and Caribbean art, landscape, and visual culture, exploring historical contexts and contemporary challenges related to development and the environment. In 2018, she began convening Entre Rios, a transnational and transdisciplinary network that departs from art practice and research to organize collaborations with river basins and communities that explore more sustainable cultures in more than human water cycles and practices. Welcome, Liliana and Lisa, and we're very happy to have you here. We have organized this Conversatorio through 4 quotes from your book as prompts for you to comment, to develop, and to extend your thoughts on water paths that the quotes open, both in this, in this research for the book, but also maybe to other projects of yours on water bodies and in your own academic and educational practices. So I will read the first quote, and then I will give you the word. This quote is from the introduction of the book, and this introduction is written both by Liliana and Lisa. And I read, following a reversal of the original vitalistic concept of flow, fluidity in the etheric register thus began to stand for a violation of norms for the freeing up of aesthetic subjectivity when it became a productive force in early 20th century aesthetic modernism. Fluidities have historically been metaphors of potent inspiration in philosophy and aesthetics, while also connoting material processes of erosion and contamination, whose valences stretch far beyond symbolic realms. End of the quote. And I give you the word if you want to comment or extend your thoughts or develop.
I maybe step in, to reflect a bit on the quote, specifically as we use this to let's say conceptualize the book, and more than that, the Liquid Ecology project. And maybe we go back to when Lisa and I had the idea and started to develop several years ago to think through and with liquid ecologies in the various dimensions, very interdisciplinary, and thinking through liquid ecology, or focusing through liquid ecology on different forms of water and fluids. So in that sense, initially we did not necessarily only think through water and with water. It just came out to be, let's say, a main venue for us. At the beginning, we thought more through the metaphor, also the ontological materials of fluids, viscosities, different kinds of materialities of water, but also other kinds of substances like liquid substances, for instance. And the book you mentioned, Liquid Ecology, I consider it an artwork by Maria Magdalena Campos Pons, where not necessarily she focused on water, but more on the distillation of alcohol through, let's say, to reflect through a submerged and unacknowledged, still invisibilized history of slavery that she recounted through the distillation of alcohol in her installation in Boston a couple of years ago. So in that sense, we were aware of that fluids and liquidities were, of course, a metaphor, but with the potential of outlining a new terrain, analytical terrain, to think human, non-human relationships. And we in that sense, we initiated to think through liquid ecologies to let's say, to understand and delve into these entanglements of human and non-humans. And we found that water at the end is a, so to speak, ontological material, not only used in artistic practices, but really also in other kinds of social movements, to be addressed seriously and also in analytical terms. And this, I think, was the starting point where Lisa and I connected to think with and through liquid ecologies.
Yeah, and maybe to come in there as well and think a little bit about how this project then came to be framed as a contribution to the field. This work began really, I think, around 16-17, through a series of collaborations, both of our conversations and finding interpoints in our own work, but also the desire to engage with other scholars working in and with Latin America and the Caribbean, whose work was engaging not purely with the notion of kind of water, but as Liliana's just proposed, this notion of liquid ecology as a discursive and analytical space which is cited at once in the kind of material and situated histories of the region in its multiple formations and continual shifts, as well as this kind of more abstract and analytical framework of how the liquid is mobilized as discourse, as symbolics, and how then that intersects with these material histories. So really trying to keep in tension constantly this notion of the liquid as a realm of dynamic becoming, which is of course contested as well, and then which enables us to think with its own materiality towards critical frameworks which help us grapple with processes of modernity in a very long historical framework. So looking back to material territorial engagements and ontological conflicts that emerge out of colonization, and the way in which those are processed through and metabolized through the land and through people's engagement with the land, rather than just water per se. And in this respect as well, as a contribution to what has been emerging as the blue humanities within the remit of the environmental humanities, we of course recognize the really important work done kind of historying the unfathomable spaces of the ocean and drawing back to the surface those important legacies of violence that are materially present in those spaces. But at the same time wanting to mark a bit of a shift away from that blue imaginary of oceanic space or the necessarily literal idea of working with freshwater bodies of water. So attempting not to, let's say, kind of have a literal cartography in that sense, or a taxonomy of particularly liquid spaces that we're interested in, but thinking about this dynamic fluid space, which kind of enables us then to account for, you know, not just water, but kind of the multiple entanglements of material, and thus kind of thinking of places where that ruptures, and as you know, the quote says here, that the material processes for erosion and contamination, which absolutely speak to our contemporary ecological moment as well.
Yeah, I think that kind of resonates with the next quote we actually selected, which is, by the way, by Liliana. It's Liliana's chapter in the book, right? The chapter is Acts of Remaining, Liquid Ecologies and Memory Work in Contemporary Art Interventions. And I think, I mean, I say it resonates with this because this idea of mobilizing the liquid, right, from a critical sense. Liliana writes, and I quote, "Art has the capacity to reveal and make perceptible the psychic and material sedimentations of forms of violence and those the economic history that often lies behind them. Their interventions reflect a new sensibility to engage various contexts for the understanding of fluids and liquids as ontological materials that are bound to the material histories of Latin America and the Caribbean." So that obviously it's related to what you were saying. Do you mind elaborating a bit more about this quote?
Thank you. Yeah, this you pulled out a very important, let's say, point of my argument in this chapter, right? Because I was intrigued when I decided to look at two work more closely. The one I mentioned, Maria Magdalena Campos Pons' intervention, but also the Clemencia Echeverria intervention through her video work. And it is, as you all know, both the region of the Caribbean and also the inter-Colombian territory, they have lived since memorial times only this kind of violence, forms of violence that they shaped a deep cultural memory. But they are not talked, or it's not easy to talk about them or perceive them. So I was like starting from the memory studies, I was a bit, let's say, upset how there was a kind of development of a more normative memory culture, specifically during the peace process of Colombia, which is at the current moment more static, or not as fulfilling as promised. So in that sense, I understood that that the memory, which is deeply embedded in the various forms of disputed or contested territories and cultural forms of living, that it's needed to go, let's say, one level deeper and to understand to various forms that the violence embedded, as I sensed, was as a psychic, or what I am interested was in this psychic and material sedimentation, how to grasp them, how to talk about them, and how to make them visible. So one moment was to look specifically at the Treno, the Echeverria's intervention, the video work, where she very clearly conceive the River Cauca as a river, as a place where memory is somehow, the normative memory or the not visibilized memory is contested, conceiving the river itself as a protagonist in this long history of violence Colombia has lived. And not only in this colonial epoch, this certainly somehow is echoed in the same way in this fluvial landscape, but also more recently with the armed conflict that happened the last 60 years. So in that sense, these video works specifically by Clemencia Echeverri made me realize that water, in this sense, in the form of the Cauca River, really becomes the protagonist to formulate an everyday memory lived by the riverine communities in contesting this official amnesia many times adopted by a Colombian government, and not be able to address these forms of forced disappearance, of not able to address the disappeared bodies that just surfaced, so to speak, in the river. So in that sense, water, or let's say the fluvial landscape, in that case, became part of a non-narrated story of violence, but also as a protagonist that help us find new forms of cultural forms of, let's say, healing to address these lacunae, to address this invisibilization. And the River Cauca was one, let's say, in the work by Echeverri, was one important, let's say, protagonist. So in that sense, I try to understand liquid ecologies, to access this deeper memory of violence and the inability to mourn, basically, to mourn because there isn't any space of echoing this loss or this loss and the violence this is perpetuating till today. And for that reason, I understood through the works by Clemencia Echeverri, but also through the works by Maria Magdalena Campos Pons, to think memory or memory practice in a different way, and going back to say to forms of water relations to help, let's say, articulate an alternative space of mourning.
Yeah, I think time is something that exercises quite a lot of us as we're working in our chapters in the book and in the work that we've been doing parallel to liquid ecologies as well. And I think it's also, as Liliana says, a way of accessing through the materiality of liquid landscapes, layers of memory which are perhaps embedded or submerged or less accessible, and also thinking about the challenge of constructing geohistories, right? So histories that are entangled with a much longer framework of sedimentations, in which, in thinking with materiality, are also attempting to get beyond the human enclosure of history as a practice that is anthropocentric, essentially. And so it's interesting also to think the way in which this project attempts not only to deal with Latin America and the Caribbean, but also to think about global experiences of time and changes in the metronome of the earth, which of course the common story of the Anthropocene. So some of this work actually has been, it's so important, the work that artists are doing, I think, in engaging us in those other frameworks, other temporalities, and engaging with that sedimentation of time and enabling us to move across it in a kind of transversal way that enables us to get into contact with different histories. And one of the things that I guess I've been trying to do in my work as well curatorially is to link up landscapes, riverine landscapes in the UK with processes that are happening in Latin America. And I think that it's important to this work, and I want to bring this to this space because, you know, you're connecting from different places, you're based in Sweden, and I think it's a really rich field for us to think about the points of connection. So we did a project with the river that runs outside of the University of Essex with an artist from Peru called Alejandro Jaime. And he is specialized in thinking with landscapes of extraction in Peru, in Chile, and thinking about the way in which large-scale human transformations of landscapes and their watercourses, of course, enables us to think about the structures of the Anthropocene as they are materializing and what stories they tell us. So we looked at the extractive histories of this very now post-industrial river in a way to think about also that process of modeling the landscape, that process of thinking of a kind of metronome of modernity, which requires and was powered by particular industrial structures, particular forms of urban culture, which have become expanded and dominant as a sort of a mode of development which has been exported and then placed elsewhere with different timescales and differing material impacts, but where there's a common ground of experiences of also engaging with bodies of water in a way that attempts to intercept the hydrological times which are antecedent to human life and to generate forms of hydraulic control which then regularize, harness, instrumentalize the rhythmicity which is entirely relational of rivers into something which is serving a very much more defined purpose for development. And so that, I think, enables us to understand kind of how that is quite a common experience across rivers in industrializing, industrial and post-industrial settings, and helps us to create some vasos comunicantes, or some connections that help us to move across space and time and to have conversations between different liquid environments that then enable us some better footing to think upon. You know, and a lot of that in the chapter that I have in Liquid Ecologies has to do with river times and to entangled and other forms of river times that come through climate, the unpredictabilities of climate, that come through also storied and rich cosmovisions, where there is a much more clear and enduring material entanglement between the sense of the river as a living entity and human beings as being entangled with it. And I think this is, you know, one of the aspects which is perhaps common to the book as well, this thinking with the rhythmicities of liquid environments as ways of understanding their political, social, economic, and ontological conditions.
So in relation to that, to what you were talking about, both of you, about the challenges posed by thinking with the materiality of the landscape, challenges in terms of thinking temporalities and thinking scales, and also the challenges posed to different disciplines. Liliana talked about memory studies. And the next quote is about challenges to the environmental humanities. And this is a quote that we have taken from the article included in the book by Sophie Hallard. And I will read the quote now. The current challenges faced by environmental humanities today deal with the need to rethink our view of nature as a tool subservient to our own embodied existence, and thus to examine our works replicating these gestures with a critical eye. The motif of water becomes the milieu in which one might be able to rethink one's relation to the environment, art making, spectatorship, and each other. And end of the quote.
Should I continue that quote, let's say, in the context of the book? Yeah, it was. It's a very inspiring chapter. I think Lisa and myself, we both were inspired with all the chapters and the author's contribution to the book. And I think without the author's contribution, the project and even yeah, the projection of liquid ecology would not have been materialized this way. So, and so specifically, her chapter really reminds me or us that thinking with water is meant seriously. So it's not a metaphor in that sense. It's not just metaphorically, symbolically said. It's something materially in the sense, and inspired also by the post-human feminist philosopher Astrida Neymanis, taking it literally, so to speak, bodies of water, understanding ourselves as bodies of water in a real sense, also in the biological sense, it's true. But that meant that we are invited, and I think most of the chapter do this, invite us to rethink our relationship through water, to rethink our relationship with, as human beings, as watery human beings, with the environment. And I think in that sense, we are at the point where we cannot continue as the way we have lived so far. And it's affecting not just lifestyle and reduction of energy or consumerism of energy. It really has to think about new dimension of care, of healing, and in that sense, the invitation to think, to take ourselves serious, more as a fluid entity, right? Instead of it's a modernist thought of individual that is somehow has a limited or a predefined relationship to the body of the community body. I think water helps us to somehow reconnect and to heal again that somehow damaged relationship with the world. Yeah, and so this is, I just mentioned this because of course the work by Neymanis is a very inspiring one, and is somehow leading us also as women bodies to rethink seriously and take seriously this relationship of care with plants, with animals, with the already damaged planet we have, and to in that sense to even not think in terms of sustainability, which is, in my understanding, a continuation of the Anthropocene thinking, right? But to think it as something, as a cyclical material way where our doing is already taking care of the oikos as an eco through our bodily engagement with the world. And I think maybe it's only implicit, and now the book is out 2 years, and as Lisa mentioned, we have initiated already about 6 years ago. And we have now continued to think through it, and I was happy last year to have realized this exhibit at the Museum der Kulturen Basel on the extractive zones, where we just had the chance to invite some artists such as Carolina Caicedo to rethink through water specifically how art in that sense can help us to define the resources in the best sense, the capacity or the potential to reconnect and heal these damaged relationship we have. And I think this is, in that sense, our starting point for Lisa and myself to understand liquid ecology as something that stretches over the book project, and really in terms of the consequences for our own position, and really, let's say, invites us to think these broad political agendas of sustainability, of politics of sustainability, etc.
I think it's really interesting the way in which, you know, in the recent 2-3 years, and we trace this history a bit in the introduction to the book, but it's continued a kind of wave of public history initiatives, art biennials, and large-scale public projects which are really engaging with water and liquid environments. And we've seen this in the recent Sydney Biennial, which is still on now, the Shanghai Biennial, which looked at bodies of water, and now there's a numerous projects across Europe as well. The Salon Nacional in Colombia is going to occur and unfold at different sites across the Rio Magdalena. So it seems to be that there's a very important moment to do this work of thinking with liquid environments, faced with this urgency that Liliana is talking about. And so the political agendas that are entangled with this work, I think, are really important to bring to the forefront as well. And Sophie, who's in Chile, continues to work in Chile and is currently doing work around experiences of care from maternal relationships, and looking specifically in her chapter in the book at the way in which the new constitution that was founded for Chile with Pinochet's dictatorship inaugurated this other way of relating to the environment as a commodification and a deadening of that matter, right, to make it into resource. And so the ways in which these historical moments can be accessed through art making critically is super important to our project, but also the thinking forward to alternative ways of relating to that enlivened and for feminist thought, right, re-enchanted world. So Chile's current constitutional reform is really important to that, as is thinking into another chapter, Rory O'Brien's work in Colombia, looking at the history of the Rio Magdalena, looking at the embeddedness of racial injustice and cognitive injustice in that riverway, and thinking that, you know, this year there are these elections which promise to have a potential for rethinking that broad relationship to the environment as well. So I think that to speak to this question of the challenges of the environmental humanities, it's very much related to forms of cognitive injustice, modes of political resistance, and the imaginative ways of creating and reclaiming, right? To think with Isabel Stange's idea of this reclamation work that's necessary, of post-development frameworks of relatedness and communities of care, ecologies of care. And it's really, I think, also inspiring to see how artists are doing work in collaboration with other fields of expertise, so socio-legal frameworks. And this is something that Liliana and I are currently working on a new phase of this collaboration together, to consider as well those concrete socio-legal challenges of what is happening with the rights of nature, what is happening with the important work being done by legal scholars and by communities in finding constitutional changes that that recognize the importance of the relatedness of human liquid bodies and other liquid bodies, right? And how can those negotiations across a human and non-human entanglement be mediated? And for that, of course, we need new forms of language. We need forms of representation that, to say it with Karen Barada, beyond representationalism, beyond the kind of constrictions of commonplace language and image, and that really attempt to get into the messy ground of considering material agency. And so these are kind of, I think those current challenges of the environmental humanities are very much present. And I think it's quite hard work to do, so that those epistemological vulnerabilities, I think, are really explored fully, and I think that is definitely a challenge, as well as kind of doing the critical work of looking back, right, and putting these places and times of these entanglements in their context, and then thinking forward as well. That's, I think, a huge and important challenge to confront.
Both. I mean, these questions give so many possibilities to keep thinking about these issues. And now I wonder if, the last quote we selected to bring it up here and listen you talk about that is very much related to what you've mentioned now. And I'm gonna quote here Esther Moñivas. She has this fantastic paragraph in which she sort of touches many of the points you've been discussing so far. So I'm quoting her here. She says, the geographical reconfiguration and the chemical footprint that water acquires as it passes through urban territories constitutes in contemporary societies a fluctuating but also very precise memory of the way in which the relationship between social constructions and nature is currently understood. The vestiges of urban culture, with millions of annual tons of uncontrolled waste dumping in waters, will undoubtedly give rise to a geological stratum that will be clearly differentiated from all previous geological deposits. From the visibility of the uncontrolled pollutants discharged in all types of water bodies to the development of purification treatments, manifold artists have developed ethical, aesthetic, scientific, and spiritual perspectives to recover the creative and curative experience of water, as well as its enjoyment and biological efficiency. So I've been thinking with this quote related to what, Lisa, you were talking about now, this need to now focus on concrete social legal challenges of environmental rights. Can you develop a bit more this idea? And also related to, we know that Liliana is working a lot with legal, the relations between law and the environment as well. So could you talk about this a bit more, please?
Maybe just to give a couple of concrete examples then that help flesh this out. So we've both been looking a bit more closely towards work being done by communities, institutions, organizations, and artists in the Atrato River, for example, in Colombia, which was recognized as a subject of rights fairly recently. And following on from that, there's been a series of commitments made to ecological restoration, which address the presence of toxic pollutants in that river and need to account for the way in which communities have been affected not only by illegal mining, but also by the conflict in Colombia. So there are a number of people working with this, and we've been in contact recently with an anthropologist, a Colombian anthropologist who's working at the Freie Universität in Berlin, Elizabeth and she's doing her doctoral work there with a foot in ethnographic work, also collaborating with the Guardianes del Atrato, the guardian group who are there to represent the river, and finding these interstitial spaces of complements between the arts and between community work and between legal structures. And the people who are doing this work, I think, are doing really important environmental humanities work, precisely because these are live events that are happening. These are ongoing legal processes. Another example of this, and straight after our meeting, I'm going to jump into another meeting, which is the pre-Venice agreement by Turbatol, which is the Chilean pavilion at Venice this year, where the project is rooted in the peatland ecosystems of Patagonia, together with the ongoing work of the Selknam indigenous community for legal recognition. So there is a biocultural rights framework there which is being actively worked upon from spaces of creative research and public engagement, whereby there is an entangled claim for both the recognition of an indigenous community and the conservation commitment to the peatlands environment which they have ancestrally and continue to inhabit today. So we can't think about ecological health without thinking about biocultural rights. And I think that that's what also this quote kind of opens up that terrain to think upon. And of course, you can't think of el atrato if you don't think of where the gold is going, right? And so there's been some really interesting work also supported by Pro Helvetia in Switzerland, linking up artists in Europe and thinking about Switzerland as a gold market with communities and artists in Colombia who are working with and or living in the Rio Trato basin, who are being affected as bodies by these toxic flows, right? And if you can't think about the peatlands in Chile if you don't think about the global picture of the need for carbon sinks, that are maintaining and retaining the carbon to mitigate the urgent, to mitigate the rise in carbon emissions, okay, which poses a global threat. So I think there's a lot going on in these very specific projects, which are working very, very locally, but also connecting very globally and helping us see the way in which the global south and the north are entangled, in the way in which all of our actions matter, right, in these material histories and the challenges that they pose.
Not sure. There's Hendrik asking a question. Maybe we just give him the floor.
Yeah, sure. Maybe we can open for some questions. But
Henrik, yeah, go ahead.
Should I start, or Hugo? No? Okay. I didn't know. Yeah. Hello, everyone, and thank you for giving this this seminar on this book. I was invited by Gianfranco, as I wrote in the message there, and really I didn't know about the volume until he told me. But it looks like a really interesting volume, and I saw it was at least one open access chapter there as well that I will read. But listening to your speaking about these on these quotes and about the book. There's several things that really aligns with stuff that I've been doing as well, and I was thinking that as a way of posing a question, you know, I've been working for a long time in South Africa. Lived there for almost 10 years, and I worked on one study that I did was around a wetland. It's called Princess Flay, and there was some really so. I think I'm attaching this to this question around the more than human and representational politics, or I'm not sure really where I'm going to land, but it's something around how I came to understand some of the power of maybe representation in how this wetland, which lies on land that was under apartheid, was classified as for coloreds only. Those classified as colored, and the city wanted to build a shopping mall. Very classic kind of urban green struggle fight. All right, well, people started mobilizing, and they're starting to use indigenous plants to plant on this field, on this wetland, to kind of claim this land. But there was also a very interesting myth or a story that came to me in the field one day, and it was Calvin, a baker turned kind of mobilizer in the area, who told me that there this flay, this wetland, has takes one young man every year, drowns a young man every year in retribution to what was made to her. And then I said, you know, what are you talking about? And then he told me that long time ago, and this is a story that he grew up with as a colored. There's a story about how Europeans came to these lands, and up the mountain, if you looked up the mountain, there's a very big gaping hole, the Elephant's Eye Cave. And in this cave, the indigenous, you know, princess of the Khoi defended her land against the Europeans. And the story goes, and the various versions about this myth, this story, she was raped and later killed. And as this was happening, she was crying, and the tears flow down the mountains to fill up the wetland, and therefore it is called Princess Flay. So what I'm trying to grasp here, you know, is the power of what of epistemology, I guess, ways of knowing, which was partly the kind of project that I was trying to engage with in the sense of this very mundane kind of wetland struggle, so to speak. And there's a really good literature historian or a literature professor in Cape Town, unfortunately died not so long ago, Hari Garuba, and he writes about the genius of paganism, which he takes from an anthropologist to study the Garuba, people in Nigeria, about the genius of paganism, this kind of what is left after colonialism. What is kind of these remains?
I don't want to interrupt you, but we will take some other questions also from the other people.
So what I'm thinking about this representation is this the way that you work with art and the liquid. How are you engaging in these different epistemologies, these different ways of knowing that you find around these different water bodies?
We keep Henrik's question. And is there other questions? So maybe we can, yes, Hugo. And if someone else has a question, we can make a pot of questions if it's okay with you.
Okay.
So we can,
Okay, well, hi, I am anthropologist and teacher from Argentina, and Azucena student in a course of her. And I was thinking about something that Liliana told before, and bueno, based in what I read about Lisa, about this ontologies of water. There's a lot of places taking what Henrik just told, where the water is an actor. It always was an actor. It's nothing new. And this Western ways of reappropriate and again colonize some ideas from native thinkings, and how can we think apart from this work, these transitions to really incorporate in the societies a change of a view, another way to relationship with water. Then I wanted to ask how in the concrete way, in everyday way, and you see these kinds of things are working. It's working like societies. How are you finding ways to make an influential change of these ways to think about water? I don't know if I'm clear. Yes.
Thank you, Hugo. Is there another question or comment?
Can we maybe respond to these? I'm concerned about forgetting
yes.
and losing the thread of also Henrik and Hugo's. So maybe if I can respond to Henrik, and then I don't know, Liliana, if you want to spend. So I think it's really interesting how these that small reflection really said so much to you, Henrik, in your work, and it unpacked a dimension of relating to landscape, which is otherwise kind of forgotten and displaced and potentially concreted over by a shopping mall, right? This is kind of the maximum expression of the bulldozing of memory. And so you raise this question of, representing, and how does art kind of speak to that? And I think that there are really interesting acts of recovering those memories and bringing them back into the present. And I think that is something that's important as well, the way in which there isn't a kind of nostalgic turn in the re-engagement of those forms of knowing, but an actualization of those as already always present in the landscape and still remaining in these places. I find it easier to speak through particular projects because I think they give us a better sense. So there's an example of an artist working in Colombia, also in a wetland environment in and around Bogota, wetlands that were inhabited by the Muisca communities before the Spanish arrived, in a sort of amphibious relationship with a wetland that would flood and waters that would recede. So finding ways to work with and live with the water for cycles of cultivation, and having a semi-nomadic existence that enabled them to move around this kind of liquid territory. Colonization happened, and this area becomes sort of successively drained, and then over modern urbanization, rivers have been forgotten, turned into sewers and disappeared. So there, what kind of memory remains? Well, memory remains in the ecosystem. So there is a particular fish which occupies these the Bogota River and the wetland area called the Pez Capitan. There's an artist called Maria Buenaventura, who's a contemporary artist, philosopher, and cook, who works through cooking and installation art to bring back the Pez Capitan, which is this fish that was the staple diet of the Muisca people, into the present and cooks with it. Today, it is a fish which is absolutely contaminated by the contamination of this river basin. And so what it means to ingest that fish as a way of connecting to those ways of knowing and living with this environment, and the knowledge that that fish is also loaded with toxins, and what it means to do that work of reclamation, to account for the care required for sustaining that life, reactivating those connections and bringing them forward into the present. So I think there's really interesting work being done by Newton. That's just one example. I can share the link so you can have a look at it, whereby through her installation work, she also brings into the present kind of specters of the agricultural technologies used to work with the land, looks at the way in which the land bears the traces of those forms of agricultural production still, and that through even satellite technology, it's possible to see in the land the imprint of those. So the kind of the collaging of the montaging of those different moments and their activation in the present through contemporary art, I think, is something that we can see creates those spaces for encounter as well, in a collective dimension, which help to bring some of those ways of knowing into forms of representation that are working with those lively landscapes and ecosystems.
Just a very quick comment there on ingesting the fish and the. I guess it's a very important way of enrolling or mobilizing others as well, and perhaps articulating the wider landscape, if it is around cooking and fishing. Yeah, it's a very good example. I also like to think through examples or other practices. Thank you.
I'm going to put the link in the chat for everyone.
Yeah, please do.
So maybe I can connect both questions, Hugo's and Henrik's, because they intersect ways of knowing and the search for new forms of representation or representing what is not representing yet to create a consciousness is something related to then effectively somehow change our behavior or change society. So in that sense, there's still a lot to do. This is my impression, and we do not have the forms of representation that allow to address toxic injustices, to allow to address the inequalities, part of that environmental pollutions, etc. But we are doing quite a bit. So I perceived specifically in the last years there's a lot of academic work done by many disciplines, and many disciplines from anthropology to legal scholars, by even literary scholars, by artists themselves through their artistic practices, even in exhibition as an institutional space, is more and more presenting and problematizing these questions. And so there is a growing body of academics, artists, and also, let's say, activists at the front line, the indigenous communities, they get more and more attention. They help to change constitutions, such as this happened in, let's say, around the Atrato River, but also in Bolivia, etc. So more and more, we see that there are some changes. As these changes are slow, I agree, and there's more to do, I also agree. But I'm confident that, I mean, this is also Lisa and my experience that legal scholars really question the still global imposed Western framework of the Roman law. They just really more and more integrate new voices of thinking law from a community-based or local epistemologies, indigenous law, epistemologies, where the idea of a legal subject really needs to get more complicated as we have it codified in the Roman law. So I see that there are many initiatives in the world, and there are more and more little changes. So in that sense, I think I'm confident that also it may reach a larger society and to make them rethink their habits in a more responsible way with the human more than human.
What's also interesting with that is kind of, sorry, just this is really quick, but accompanying this from a European perspective as well. So the UK at the moment is having a real moment of collective protest against sewage discharges into rivers, which is in itself an effect of the privatization of water companies, very poor regulation. And what's actually making a difference to that as well is people's experience of connecting much more with blue spaces, quote unquote, during the pandemic, and the way in which that stopping of the status quo as business as usual also reconnected people. So, you know, there's a kind of an uptick in forms of protest as well by open water swimming groups who are now reinvested in the stewardship of rivers, and citizen science groups which are being activated and looking at that. So again, it's interesting, I think, for us to think about the way in which there are also kind of global expressions of this need for a change in relating, which happen across very distinct contexts, but where there is some interesting common ground as well to think about what they are pushing us towards changing.
Maybe we would really like to continue discuss this, because you made so interesting examples that it's thought-provoking. But maybe we need to round up, because so we don't want to take more time from you, from the one that we said we were going to this conversation was going to take. So maybe we really thank you for sharing your thoughts, and as I said, we've read your book, we use it in our research, but we also used it in courses that we teach. So it's really been a pleasure to hear you like commenting on exploring and developing your ideas, and we really want to thank you for this time, and for the materials and the suggestions that you share to read and to continue thinking with water, through water, and through these landscapes of devastation. And also that the idea that there is a hope, and there is hope. I think there's in many places they are talking about watershed laws, in Argentina, and in some other places that in Latin America. So I think that there is something to look into the future more than extinction. So, well, I don't know if you want to say some last words, Gianfranco.
I just want to say thank you. It was a real pleasure, and thank you, Henrik, also for sharing your questions with Lisa and Liliana. I really, really appreciate it. And just remember to check out Rizoma's website. We will continue these conversations, these conversatorios. So we highly encourage you to join us next time if you have time and if you want to do so. Thank you again. Gracias.
Yes, thank you for the question, Hugo, too, and for being here from Argentina. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, it was
Thanks
a
so much for
pleasure.
the invitation.
Muchas gracias
Yeah,
a
real
todos.
pleasure.